She live streamed. Okay, go. Dr. Rajesh is Associate Professor in History and Head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Mohali, Punjab. Dr. Pariti, Assistant Professor and currently Head, Department of History, University College for Women, Koti Osmania University, Hyderabad. And Sagnik Saha is doctoral research scholar, Department of History, University of Hyderabad, working on the social landscape of the rural in the early Deccan, where he earlier researched on the early Indian peasants in the Arthashastra and the Jatakas for his MPhil. A very warm welcome to all of you. Before handing over the session to Professor Sen, I just want to announce a couple of things. For the audience here, we will be starting with presentations. The first presentation will be Dr. Sen, followed by Dr. Rajesh, Sagnik, and then Dr. Pariti. Post the presentations, we will open the session up to Q&A. We request you to put your questions in the chat, and please mention who you are addressing the question to in the chat itself. All the speakers will, respond to the questions that come in the chat, and time permitting, after the Q&A is over, we would also, open it up to an informal discussion if there are participants here who wish to discuss anything further, but this is going to be subject to time permitting. So over to you, Dr. Sen.
So thank you very much, Megha. Thank all of you actually at History for Peace and Seagull Books for organizing this. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen to begin the discussion. So we entitled the workshop, The Fragment in History, Text, Object, and Local History. And as you said, this is like kind of based on the book that was published this year called Seeking History Through Her Source, South of the Vindhyas. And there are two issues over here, which perhaps all of us have consciously made an effort to do, and that is highlighting that the source is more important than just the narrative of history. So the particularity of the source, looking at unusual sources of information, which I'll just talk about. And the other is that we've sort of exemplified it through case studies south of the Vindhyas, but it must be stated right in the beginning that the application of what we have to say can be for any part of the country. So it's just not just simply south of the Vindhyas. So very briefly, the book is divided into two parts. One we entitled Perceiving the Past, which sort of addresses issues around poems and stories and literary narratives. And the second, which talks about, it's called Producing the Past, which talks about actual sources like coins, inscriptions, or art objects. And there are contributions by 8 of us, and those that are highlighted in blue, as Megha has just announced, are with us. I noticed that Srikala and Nairata are also with us, so they will probably participate in the discussion. And the themes that we addressed in the book are making of the classical Tamil literature, reading the Jatakas, looking at images of space and power in the Kavya literature, the idea of water in the Shangam poems, identities and fragments, basically looking at small label inscriptions, local coins and local rulers, and then the prashastis of these Chalukyan rulers, and trying to see how history is understood in the prashastis. And then, of course, looking at stray fragments of information and how we can make sense of writing a history based on these. Now, as Megha has already announced, just giving you the titles of what each one of us is going to do in the workshop. One is, of course, I'll just introduce very briefly some of the ideas. And of course, these ideas have come to us from scholarly interventions before us. So I'll just highlight those. And then Rajesh will look at literature and history. And of course, he'll explain what he exactly wants to do. And then Sagnik will look at texts which are written as well as oral. And of course, Aruna will be looking at material texts, primarily inscriptions. So we'll spend roughly 15 minutes each to introduce our points of view. And we really do seriously feel that the nature of this workshop is that we should have a kind of a discussion and dialogue. So I hope you can jot down your points and let us know how we can respond to you, and maybe exemplifications we will do in the question and answer. So maybe our statements will be general, but exemplifications will be in the discussion. So one of the first things that I always like to emphasize is, why did we want to use the terminology her source? Usually, I mean, most of you who are historians know that there is a kind of an authoritarian relationship that history has with her source. In other words, the source is kind of treated as a kind of a mechanical, technical kind of apparatus. But indeed, it's the other way around. The source, in fact, defines what the nature of history is. And here, of course, I have a Clio of an image of a marble image of the 2nd century CE, where she is history's patron, actually. And she not only retells history based on factual accounts, but also on stories, So this brings in the element of a variety of sources, which over here, most of you are familiar with them. But what happens with the sources over historical time, the emphasis on the nature of the source has been changing. So originally, scholars and historians were really worried about the so-called documents of history, where facts are built in, the manuscripts or artifacts which are in situ. When social and cultural history began to be more fashionable, then of course fictional sources were also used, like novels, plays, and photographs, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, in recent times, scholars have been very focused on, looking at what we call the hardcore evidence, a historical sculpture or a painting or a building. Of course, these are all created in time. So, of course, their location is important, and significantly their interpretation. I mean, how do you interpret let's say, isolated building and so on and so forth? And then both in archaeology and in epigraphy, we differentiate between literature and these sources, because we think that literature is like much more nebulous, and then the hardcore evidence is much more tangible. I mean, that you can feel it and you can see it, and you can, you have a date and so on and so forth. And finally, most recently, people have been drawing upon oral ways of retrieving past. Now, why did I give you an outline of all these? Is because there is an assumption that there is a kind of a source located in the past, and that we are all going back to the source. But I'd like to, sort of draw your attention to what Anchor Schmidt in this journal called History and Theory some time ago, well, now 20 years, 30 years ago, wrote. And he argued that if you're writing within the modernist framework, you follow a line of reasoning from your sources as evidence to a historical reality. So the source as evidence to historical reality, which is hidden behind the source. But if you're writing in the context of a postmodernist view, then the evidence does not point to the past, but it only points to interpretations of the past. This is a very, very important point to emphasize, because all sources are constructed, of course. And secondly, I mean, he raised right in the beginning of this essay the whole question of is there a where is Plato's text, original text? Actually, what you have is interpretations of Plato, and that is what you go back to from time to time to understand what Plato is. So these are so interpretation comes in as construction of the source, and interpretation becomes very important. And which brings me to the 3 or 4 points that each of our presentations will highlight. One is that we are standing on a ground where we understand history as a modern discipline within the scientific basis of the and we are located actually in a space called the modern nation state, right? So we are when we say we are dialoguing with history, we are dialoguing with this kind of understanding. What Anthony Grafton and many of us drew upon his reading of there's a book called The Footnote in History, wherein he says that let us get over the fact that it is simply of technical use. Because when you say a footnote is simply of technical use, you tend to dismiss it, or you tend to, sort of not give it that, you don't give the worldview of the footnote an importance, but you just simply use it because it's of technical use. What he says is that the value of this footnote depends on the position that this footnote is located in, and to what extent authority and power define its use. So it's us who give it this power or this position, and by giving it, so we usually decide documents are more important than, let's say oral testimonies and so on. And the second thing that everybody addresses is this question of the relationship between history and memory. And therefore, I think that one needs to differentiate, and this is what I should briefly tell you about, that we need to differentiate history from the other narratives of the past, which are based on memory. And this is not to say that history doesn't have embedded memory in it also. And finally, of course, if we have to rethink history, then I drew upon this journal, Rethinking History. It's called Rethinking History. And scholars like Hayden White and many scholars, drew our attention to the fact about the relationship of the historical and the fictional, and that if we shouldn't mix the two, obviously, but and confuse them. But the fact of the matter is that unconsciously we are drawing upon the fictional as well when we are writing history. And in India, I think one of the important issues that we raised in the introduction was how do you straddle the modern and the pre-modern, because these, as Daudali wrote in his Invoking the Past book, pre-colonial forms of knowledge are too often relegated to a kind of a space where they act as a foil for the drama of modernity. So there is a kind of a, sort of a loose status that is given to the source. You don't give it much importance. Now, relationship between history and memory, very briefly, there is a difference between the two, of course. So Pierre Nora, whose fundamental work many of us draw upon, tells us that memory usually refers to a process, and memory is used profusely in traditional cultures, whereas history is how modern societies propel change and how they organize the past. So sometimes history is only about selective official memories, and they sift and sort out whatever depending on the location so that they can regenerate a nation's history. Whereas memory, of course, is talking about, a totally different thing where the society's memory is linked to the process of the making of that society. So acceleration of history then rejects experience. It rejects custom. There's a silence on that. And of course, it rejects the ancestral. And all these things I do feel are built into both the literary and the non-literary sources that we very happily use to write history. And then another scholar called Bernard Lewis differentiated. He says, let's not confuse proper history with what he called remembered history as a collective historical consciousness embedded in a society's inherited historiography or collective memory. Now, this has become very significant in our current times because this inherited historiography or collective historical consciousness tends to replace what a historian, a professional historian does in the classroom or at the site of the university. And what we call sources, scripts, monuments, coins, excavated material, all this he defines as recovered history. So there is a process by which you recover the source. Now, these recovering of the source then is built into that point in time where it is recovered. And this entire Orientalist debate, etc., all stems from these issues about recovering the past and framing it. And of course, then all modern interpretations of history. Now, very briefly, before I end, the idea of a fragment. So we've looked at the fragment as the small, the fictional, the fragmentary script or text, marginal oral text, or an object which is found in local niches. So the local becomes very important for us to stand on the local and then talk about the lives of people, past lives, both materially as well as at an ideential level. And very, very long ago in the 1940s, Sigvard Gieden had informed us that fragments are all over. History writing is ever tied to the fragment, and that springs from one period to another. You keep having fragments, but we tend to shove the fragments into the background. But here we are trying to bring them to the foreground. And then other scholars who've looked at fragments, mainly art historians and so on and so forth, they argue that it is legitimate to use the fragment, especially for very, very ancient societies and ancient periods. The fragment is in fact used as a legitimate source because there's very little that is available for those periods. So Friola and Owen say that regardless of scale, form, or function, their objects are found in fragments, meaning that when there is a non-verbal language, then this object, which is a fragment, which is visually visible to us, becomes a very important means to write history. And finally, of course, Appadurai and others have looked at the life history or what they call the biography of individual artifacts. And sometimes it's very difficult to get to terms with what is the biography of a fragmentary object or a thing. But nonetheless, they should not divert us. I mean, monolithic histories divert us into such a space that we forget that there are these life histories, that there are these individual artifacts. So in conclusion, what one has endeavored to do is that usually history, whatever theoretical position you stand on, you tend to give a singular voice. And we have tried to say that there's no harm in having multivocal voices. And this is multivocal voices is not only as objects of history, but also that each of these so-called objects of history or subjects of history, more like it, they have ways of perceiving the past. So do we reject these other ways of perceiving the past, right? And if we look at history, then history wants to retrieve the truth of the past, whereas actually we should be trying to find out in as possible ways as we can the reality of the past. So there's a difference between the reality of the past and the truth of the past. And we haven't focused on each of these different categories of marginalized people or groups, but basically all peoples that are dominated by class, caste, patriarchy, or cultural domination become the focus of our interest. And very significantly, I personally feel that when we talk about local groups, it highlights the identity of people, right? So when identities come into play, then over space and time, then the question of the relationship of power and resistance becomes very important. So it's no use saying, oh, we are moving to the region and we are moving into the locality. But within the locality also, there are structures of power and hierarchy that have to be addressed. So to what extent are we able to give voices, a multivocal voice, or to what extent are we able to bring multivocal voices onto the page, or onto our pages, is something that we have attempted to address in this book. And hopefully after the others make their presentations, we will get more insights. And I just sort of give you a general idea to the introduction of the book. Thank you. So, Rajesh.
All right. My presentation is titled "The Making of Classical Tamil Literature: A View from the Fragment." The spirit that informed our investigations in the volume is Anthony Grafton's "The Footnote: A Curious History." It is appropriate to begin by paraphrasing Grafton. While sources are central to history writing, the tendency in historiography is to take sources for granted. Grafton points to the need to subject sources we use to historical investigation. Not only should historians begin interrogating the nature of the sources, but also locate them in their socio-economic and ideological context. In the context of the history of South India, one of the important works is that of Nilakanta Sastri. In many ways, the work is typical of the approach of historians of the first half of the 20th century, in which literature constituted one of the significant sources to reconstruct the history of the region. This quote from Shastri's A History of South India indicates not only the evidential character of literature as a source of history, but also a taken for granted attitude towards literature as a given source. As Sastry put it, I quote, "The first well-lighted epoch in the history of Tamil land is that reflected in the literature of Sangam, that is, the first 3 or 4 centuries AD. The earliest stratum of Tamil literature now available," unquote. Relying on such text, we get an overview of the political history of early South India in the works of Shastri. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, there was some sort of a mutual learning between historians and literary scholars. While literary scholars used the work of historians to situate the works chronologically, the historians treated literature as a source to reconstruct history. However, there was hardly any theoretical basis and orientation in the practice of history and literary criticism in the Tamil milieu, except broadly within the positivist empiricist framework. Now, this approach shifted in the second half of the 20th century. There was a welcome shift in historiography in the second half when historians subjected the source to historical scrutiny. While earlier the tendency was to treat such corpus as Sangam literature as evidence for the early history of the South, now the questions of transmission and reproduction of such text in literary tradition and history were examined. This shift involved examining the histories of such ancient literature in literary tradition and during the colonial period. While the early Sangam texts were published in printed editions during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the history of the making of these texts was recounted in modern scholarly writings from the perspective of the editors of these texts. The history writing underlined the centrality of printing and publishing of early Tamil literature as constituting an important moment in the modern period, contributing to such developments as Tamil Renaissance and Dravidian nationalism. This strand of historiography further informs us that the Sangam corpus was dramatically rediscovered during the colonial period with the coming of print. Inherent in such an understanding is that these texts were forgotten and marginalized for a couple of centuries during the pre-modern period due to sectarian bias. The basis of this understanding stem from perceptions of dominant structures and literary personalities in Tamil society, namely the Saiva monastery in Tanjore and the autobiographical account of Swaminatha Iyer, one of the important editors of Tamil classics in the modern period. In recent years, the rediscovery of classics in a dramatized sense has been questioned with the focus on an alternative set of hitherto unused sources. The newly emerging studies provide an alternative framework for understanding the 19th century reproduction of classical Tamil literature by marshalling and examining the palm leaf manuscripts that modern editors of classics used to publish the first printed editions. This has involved examining the nature of palm leaf manuscripts, their provenance, textual particularities, intertextuality, and so on. Such studies have allowed us to see the fascinating world of the Pulavars, of the scholars, Kavirayars, of the poets, Ubadhyayars, of the teachers, and institutions beyond the orbit of Shaivite monasteries in Tamil Nadu. Now, these are these alternative set of sources which have hitherto been unused provide us a new histories of transmission of classics, or what I call the making of classics in literary tradition and in the colonial period. We also have new themes of investigation. One of the article included in the volume is that of Srikala, who looks at the perception of water in classical literature, and also by creatively reading the nature-culture interaction in the classical text. Thank you.
So are you done?
Yeah.
Okay. No, your screen was still there. So Sagnik, you want to start?
Yes, yes. So I will be. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yeah.
So I will be talking about the history, the textual, sources, and both written and oral. And I think focusing on the Jatakas. So let me start by one of the quotes from Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life. It is evidence which can only be fantastic and not scientific, of the disproportion between the everyday tactics and the strategic elucidation. Just a second, man. I think. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Elucidation of all the things everyone does, how much gets written down. Between the two, the image, the phantom of the expert but mute body preserves the difference. Now, what I will be doing in this very short presentation is that I will be talking about how a certain kind of scriptural economy of the early Indian historiography had been constructed, right? And I will begin with saying that with the incorporation of Indian past into the order of world history, this scriptural economy was produced where the pasts and the cultural memories were consecrated for objective examination by the historiographical operations in the sites of writing, archives, and museums. Owing to the Protestant presuppositions of the colonial rulers, the normative doctrine sacred texts were disentangled from the disparate voices through philological scrutiny, and then they were reinvented as the dominant sites of memory, where the expert but the mute bodies whereas they were obscured into the, let's say, zones of silence or the sites of forgetting. They were only available in the fragments and some part in silences. Now, in this discussion, what I will emphasize on few themes, right? And one of them is that the multiphasic entanglement that we had of the orality and literacy in the early modern literary culture. And I will be focusing again by repeating the same thing, that Pali commentaries that we have as called Jataka Attavannana. And then I will briefly point out the different biographical imperative in the Harshacharita of Banabhatta also as an articulative text with clear authorial intent, as it has been discussed by one of our contributing authors, Mrinalini, in this book as well. And then finally, I will be discussing about the stories that mostly read as dialogic, transformative texts and with embedded social memories, and not just the passive source material with factual informations. Now, to begin with, the topic is called the strong memory culture, and this theme has been taken from Jan Hauben and Sarajurat's book on the manuscript culture. Now, Jack Goody and Jan Watt argued for an almost essential relationship between the science, rationality, and literacy that seems untenable in the South Asian experience. Because the oral literal dichotomy neither recapitulates a folk elite binary, nor does it seem commensurable with the European experience of this cultural historical stages from oral, as in primitive, and then to print. And also to point out that there was not only this obsession with the Vedic orality that we have, there are also multiple kind of oral literature that we had in Buddhist and Jain traditions, and they showed significant indications. Even when we have a very strong textual memory culture, we have that strong indications of oral conditions of their early compositions, and even in early inscriptions, which were the medium, in a written medium, we see the presence of the vachanikas or the proclaimers that suggests that there was a public which were alphabetical, and for them they need to really pronounce it, the whatever is written in those inscriptions. But one thing that we really need to consider is that not all the kind of oralities that we have, they are equal, and this can be divided into majorly two kind of orality. One, that is high orality. It is formal and reliable in their preservative function, and informal relaxed orality of the everyday that I am going to highlight upon. Now, Vedic traditions and the oral epics illustrated this high orality and a very deliberate orality. Vedic transmission depended on this very poetic sophistication of the various meters that it had, and very isolated transmission, whereas oral epics had a rather simpler identical meters and a wider scope of transmission. Now, along with that, to go into so-called other tradition, if I can, Richard Nance, in his speaking for the Buddhas, has also shown that with the proliferation of writing and of the canonical texts, as well as the commentaries in the early Indian society, the oral transmissions and the practices of preaching retained its normative authoritative position, despite there were despite the significant changes in their earlier process, because now this text gets higher stability. Now, also we have to consider that the works on the folkloric kind of a tradition that had been done mostly by Stuart Blackburn and A.K. Ramanujan's Another Harmony, that also shows that various oral and written traditions often coexisted in a complex multiphasic interlacing process of transmission and retellings, and also as well as that translations, right? I mean, when they're happening, it's a very multiphasic kind of a engagement, cyclical kind of an engagement in their transmission and preservation. Now, I will go to the next slide, and I will just briefly show that how the Jatak as a text has been read so far. And we have several authors in 1920s to 40s like Richard Figg, Ratilal Mehta, A.N. Bose, who had read very positivistically this text as a pre-Buddhistic kind of a society. It is reflecting directly that, and then that segment of historiography positivism when it led way to the other critical historiographies, the further Marxist historiographies, we see that the Jatakas become they became very reluctant to use the Jataka as a as a complete source of the narrative. They only picked up fragments to bolster their own arguments, and because there is no chronological consistency, there is no authorial there is a serious authorial ambiguity. And then they were considered, because they were considered inferior textual corpus, no philological scrutiny also ever taken up this text for their investigation. And so it has been also relegated to certain kind of popular domain or a folk domain, in contrast to the high culture. The binary that I think is really problematic when it comes to the very deeply mediated kind of a textual corpus that we get as Jatakas. And I would, in the next, phase, I will keep on reading Jatakas, how to read Jatakas as a dialogic and transformative text, which also, led us to reconsider and rethink our own, society, and as well as at that point of time, and with the heterogeneous ensemble of the voices and practices, and not as monologically closed utterances, right? So Jataka Arthavarnana, as we can see, it's a commentarial tradition that was that was written in the 5th century CE, as a associated, tales like of the Jatakapali verses, and it has been also relegated to margin of the Khuddaka Nikaya as a kind of miscellaneous kind of a position, right? But we can see that in the this existing corpus, never really got the acquired status of canon as much as we want to get it like till the 5th century CE, when it is getting, and it's a very awkward presence in the whole corpus. Now there are parallel existence of these tales as autonomous fields of art, autonomous fluid utterances, and that can be inferred from the presence of the identical tales without the verses even, and sometimes with the verses, in different Nikaya texts like Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, so on and so forth, which were named as embedded Jataka by Naomi Appleton. Also, yet there were substantial indications of the earlier process of these texts, which is happening parallelly before the canonical formation, is that we can see from the bracket of, let's say, temporal bracket of 3rd century BCE to 3rd century CE. We see the sculptural representations of the Jatakas in the prominent stupa reliefs of the Barhut, Sanchi, Amravati, Nagarjun Konda, Kanaganahalli. And these sculptures indicate a symbolic appropriation and fixation of the heterogeneous ensemble of social memories, and then that were embedded into the tales within the larger cultural memory with really grand temporal scale, into that sacred space. And the space of the stupas had been used to kind of crystallize these tales into some form of Buddhist memory. We have also found out that the transmissions of the Buddhist texts were entrusted to the group of Bhanakas, who were to memorialize different sections of the Buddhist textual corpus, and had been monitored multiple times in pillar inscriptions of Barhuta Sachi as well. They had been mentioned there, and the recognition of the Jataka Bhanaka as a separate preserver and the reciters in the text of the Milinda Panha also suggests that there was a relative autonomy and a parallel oral performance that was that was in practice prior to the commentary. Now, however, the greater reliance on the written transmission later on changes the role of the Bhanakas, as we can see from the real transmitter or the preserver of the text from the the public reciter in that way. And we then see that how the Buddhist biographical imperatives had been there to curb this to close this kind of fluidity of multiple meanings and multivocality that is existing into these texts and these tales. We see the sacrosanctity of the Buddha Vachana, and their memories had been given. We see the characters had been recognized with the Buddhist personalities. We see the tactical expertise or the prudence that has been shown as Buddhist virtues like Panchashila or Dasashila, which also highlight the embedded moral texture of these tales. So what I'm trying to say is that even though Buddhist mediation had been seen as either Buddhist, it is a Buddhist text or it's a folk text, this binary does not work, because it is only with the Buddhist mediation, I think, the embedded moral texture of these tales that gets highlighted, right? And then the long introduction of Nidana Katha with the macro temporal closure that we have. Now, to talk about briefly a very different kind of genre that we have, the Charitas, and this Charitas have this poetic narrative of the Charitas, and with the temporal sequentiality, remained an object of intentional text, right? And it's an intentional text or with text which is an object of intent, and with a shared intersubjective structure of meaning and with avenues of innovative configurations. So it is also not really a very monolithic closed text as one would see. The Charitas, with the kavic forms and aesthetics, remain different in their authentic portrayal of their biographical subjects based on the collected memories and the immediacy of experience, and distinguished themselves from the bardic textual corpus, which was mostly based on recollection of a distant cultural memory. Now here the authorial credentials and intentions have been described unambiguously to constitute a narrative with selective sequence of the events, legitimizing the dynastic rule and publicizing the royal activities simultaneously. Now we can see the process of inscribing the political will with collating both the cultural, the mythic cultural memory and the collected immediate memories as an innovation in the literary culture. And the courtly, and I would try to bring out how Mrinalini has seen it, is that just because it had this pretextual imperative of being courtly or having elite patronage, it does not really obscure the polyphonic or the critical apparatus of the text by reducing them to that intent. And also Professor Sonalika Kaul in her essay has talked about the Bithi, Bhana, Prahasana, all these kind of public performances, and also in Harshacharit we find there were mentions of public rituals where the common public can gather and enjoy this kind of it can create a milieu which is based on both elite and the common. Now when a near reading of these texts exclusively within the boundaries of their primary textual tradition may obscure this interaction, I think with the certain themes and interactions with certain themes and voices, like let's say Shabaras and the Kiratas and how the geographies of the power has been articulated, I think if we look at from afar, it's a far reading can actually highlight those kind of an approach that is not there in their own literary tradition and in their own literary treatment of the theme. Now let me just end with saying that what do we mean by storytelling and what do I mean by ordinary ethics. Now for me, what I tried to do here is that because it has always been the textual corpus of Jataka has always used in the fragments of certain kind of factual information, I am going against this archival grain, right? And I'm trying to read these stories as a moral act which reproduced the collective memory then and which is also in dialogue with us now, right? And the story that created this intersubjective space with conflicting wills and intentions of their quotidian life worlds. And as a reader, when I'm reading it, I'm also getting into, as a part, ethically, I'm also reading this text and trying to, not being distant to it, and rather trying to follow what kind of, techniques, what kind of embedded, situated decisions and, concerns and ethical enmeshment with the others that can be found from these tales. Now, what has been highlighted in this text by people like Stephen Collins and Naomi Appleton and even Uma Chakravarti and Kumkum Roy, the ethics of reciprocity is one of the main theme in the Jatakas. But this ethics of reciprocity does not remain in it as an absolute value, but it remains in the fragments of multiple gestures and different social practices, and that are sedimented in the collective memories. And the moment we say memories, it is not always about the recollection. It is also about the bodily, habitual memories, gestures that we always recreate and reproduce through our own, daily, ordinary, banal acts. Ethics must then be located in a situated choices and utterances, and in recognizing the growing unethical in the ordinary life and the vulnerability of others, because ethics is always at play between the dominated and the dominant. So at the end, we think that the recognition of the others and the related situated choices and preserved and transmitted and relived and reenacted in these tales had a transformative impact on the moral lives. And one of the prime example of this had been shown by Charles Hallisey and Anne Hansen in their ethnographic work on the Theravada communities in Southeast Asia, where they're showing that how these tales actually opened up a broader moral horizon, and then they could associate themselves with a different kind of communities who are inhabiting with them. And so the Buddhist monastery does not really situated into the boundaries of that monastery and their own life, but rather in interaction with this different kind of communities and create a larger moral world where they can situate themselves as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. So you can stop sharing your screen. Yeah, thank you. So Aruna, would you like to start?
Yes, ma'am. So, very good afternoon to one and all. My presentation would be focusing on looking at the importance of material texts as sources of history writing. And what I mean by material texts are those that are inscribed on hard evidences, the tangible evidences. Like we have several objects on which inscriptions are engraved. Like we have here, stone inscriptions, copper plates, we have pillar inscriptions, bricks, and then inscriptions were engraved on wood and several other tangible material. And so in India, these types of inscriptions are found in different parts, and also there are large number of inscriptions that were discovered during various excavations and also during explorations and all. So historians actually used these inscriptions to write about the Indian past. And while assessing the importance of these inscriptions as sources to construct early Indian history, eminent epigraphist D.C. Sarkar, he states that the great importance of inscriptions lies in the fact that they generally offer information about personages and events of Indian history about which nothing is known from any other source. Hence, these are considered as very valuable to construct the ancient Indian past. And almost a similar view was expressed by J.F. Fleet, who was one of the most prominent epigraphists, and he had remarked that for our knowledge of ancient political history, we are indebted only to inscriptions and not to any other source, which was bequeathed to us by the Hindus. So this very clearly tells us that the importance of inscriptions as knowledge base, and also for providing the authentic historical information for later generations to write history, particularly during the 20th century and all. And the major emphasis for all these historians who are writing in the 20th century was mainly political history. And modern historians, they treated inscriptions as hardcore evidence of historical information. And because they considered that these inscriptions are very useful. Why? Because these connect to inscriptions, because they are being inscribed on tangible material, they are treated as hardcore sources, and they connect to specific time and space, and they reflect what people were actually thinking. And they are constructed based on archival records and past memories. And inscriptions are also used as major source of information on political structures, administration, and revenue systems. And they shed light on the settlement patterns, agrarian relations, forms of labor, class, caste structures. And they also help in understanding the technical vocabulary that was used for various designations of officials, and also the terms, fiscal terms that were used and all. And they also provide datable information, and also very useful for understanding the history of religions, religious sects and all. And also they may refer to geographical boundaries. Thus historical geography also can be written based on these inscription sources. So this has become, in fact, the primary motive of the historians who were writing in the 19th century. So they wanted to look at this type of information while writing the history during the 19th century and 20th century also. So all this information actually was retrieved from different types of inscriptions. So we have these different types of inscriptions, like we have rock edicts, which are usually Ashokan edicts, which includes major and minor rock edicts. And these are usually engraved on stone and pillar. And since they are royal proclamations, so these have been used to write Ashoka's how Ashoka tried to spread his ideas of Dhamma and all this. And next we have donative inscriptions. These are very, very important, and these have been actually found in large numbers throughout the subcontinent and in many parts, especially from the 6th century. Historians largely relied on this type of inscriptions, and they are usually engraved on copper plates and temple walls, and they record donations made to Brahmins, officials, and temple institutions. And these are eulogistic in nature also. And next we have commemorative inscriptions, which are found in stone, and these records the celebration of events like victories in war by kings, and also followed by the eulogy about the king. And for example, Allahabad pillar inscription is one such thing, which gives a complete eulogy. Even Ravikirti's Aihole Prasasti is another one. And then we have also miscellaneous inscriptions like hero stones. When a person achieves some, it records achievements of people in the wars and war heroes, and also there are also some fragments of inscriptions which were usually found at many parts of South India and the Deccan, and these actually record the people's visit to some religious establishment and their donations, a small. So these are in small, in a line or something like that. Okay, so these are various types of inscriptions. Out of these, my focus would be on donative inscriptions, because donative inscriptions has these type of components, like there's an invocation. First is a preamble. Preamble consists of invocation and prasasti. Invocation is that which begins with an auspicious word or a symbol, and like it has a swasti, and then there are some invocatory verses. There is a mangala, and then there is an invocation to a deity, like Om Namo Buddhaya, like that. They keep, they give this Om Namo Narayana, and this type of invocations to the deity are also found in the invocation. And then the most important part, which I'm going to focus in my later presentation, is on the prasastis. So these consist of genealogies of the ruling family. And the next important component of donative inscriptions is notification. And this usually introduces a donee, the one who receives the grant, and it refers to the genealogy and the qualifications of the donee, and also the people who were present, administrative officials, and also the local people, kutumbikas they are called as, and the people or nivasins who were present at the time of issuing the grant. And then it also mentions the nature of the grant and its boundaries, like what would be the extent of the grant and all, and also provides information on the list of pariharas or exemptions or privileges to be enjoyed by the donee. And then also mentions the occasion and purpose of the grant. It is this that makes inscription more authentic also, and because it also refers to the date. So that is why inscriptions are also called as legal charters. And the next part, you have the conclusion, and this usually deals with an exhortation to the people. So those who violate the grant would be punished in the hell for 60,000 years or something like that. This type of verses you can find in conclusion. And it also mentions the names of engraver, writer, and also the person who conveys this royal order to the people, that is Agnapti or Dutaka. And then also it gives the date of the inscription. Again, this is provided, this is the actual date during the time when the inscription, when the donation is being made by the king. So it provides the details of the month, fortnight, tithi, weekday, and then it has a royal seal Okay, so all this makes these donative inscriptions more authentic and more reliable for the historians to write on the histories. Okay, but but what is very important is to focus on the precisties. Okay, this type of hitherto historians used all this information which I mentioned, like notification, conclusion, and even the invocation and all this. And their major focus was to construct or to create the fundamental structures of political history as backbone of all historical narratives. And so this trend continued up to 1960s. And then from 1960s, people started looking at the other things like they were looking at how the temples functioned, who are the social groups who are involved in temple functioning, and even in religious patronage. And they were also trying to look at agrarian relations and the social and economic setup during the pre-modern period, and also the nature of political structures and all this. However, they failed to understand, or maybe they did not give so much of focus on these precisties or eulogies. These are often remained as underdeveloped. The similar concern was expressed even by Daud Ali, particularly considering the number of inscriptions that were found in South Asia. These precisties or the eulogies were given least importance while writing the history. And so many modern historians therefore also neglected or did not really bother to look at the mythical genealogies. These are the various contents of genealogy. Precisties contained mythical genealogies, which refers to Gotra, Kula, Vamsa, and it traces the family's genealogy to eponymous sages. Okay, and then historical genealogy, it mentions the number of rulers who ruled and also their regnal years. And in some cases, we also find semi-historic genealogies where the rulers were trying to attempt or try to link their families' genealogies to Itihasa Purana traditions, which had pan-Indian importance. And they also contained eulogistic information about kings, their ancestors, kings' ancestors, and their titles, which are military achievements, Vedic sacrifices. Some of them are hyperbolic also, and it also contained the elaborate accounts of ruling kings, their titles, epithets, political symbols which they acquired after defeating the rulers of the north or their contemporary rulers, and the military achievements of the rulers. Then they also try to make comparisons with epic and Puranic heroes, and marriage networks is another important thing which they try to build up. And then in some cases, we also found brief eulogies of the queen. Okay, so these were very important in the sense that most of the historians try to look at, but some of these things they try to leave because they did not find the comparisons with epic and Puranic heroes as significant, and they also did not find these military achievements of ancestors or semi-historic, mythical, and historical genealogies as very insignificant for their writing history, because the scholars who were writing during this 20th century, they were writing history within the framework of the empiricist or the work, positivist methodology. Hence, they did not give so much importance to these type of histories. So interwoven for us, these type of histories like mythical genealogies, semi-historical and historical genealogies, and even all these contents which are found in the precisties are very significant, because interwoven with this genealogical information, like these military conquests and all these things, they portray the king's image in accordance with the convention adopted by the medieval court poets, who placed their patron in the position of a universal sovereign. And in such constructions of the past, therefore, memory was socially constructed to present a sense of identity that was distinctly different from others. So in drawing on these pan-Indian traditions and being considered on par with heroes from the epics and Puranas of ancient Indian tradition, which was largely popularized through oral tradition and rooted in social memory. So these type of informations in the Prasastis, they become basis for court poets to further enhance the image of the king and to get respect from their subjects. So therefore, Prasastis should be viewed as not only as historical texts that were composed by court poets by collating various sources for their patrons to legitimize the political authority of the king, of the family and dynasty in power. Therefore, in our opinion, rather than dismissing them as an irrelevant and exaggerated source of history writing, these need to be paid attention to an alternative ways as texts that notions of history embedded in them. And the different types of genealogies, like such as a mythical, semi-historical, and historical genealogies, they also present in the Prasastis, which are present in the Prasastis. They also purport to different notions of time, which is very important, such as mythical time, which is rooted in an atemporality, historical time, which was reckoned through the narration of list of rulers, and dated time, which specifically mentions dates along with giving genealogical information. So therefore, the Prasastis which were presented before us, both cyclic, they present before us both cyclic and linear notions of time. And these are very essential for any historical writing, as it provides authenticity to the source. So the source here is the inscriptional Prasastis. Here, tradition was used to represent and represent the past because tradition was invariably treated to fulfill its legitimizing function by referring to the past, which was rooted in cosmic notions of time. And the preparation of Prasasti is also entails the presence of memory. So in order to prepare this type of Prasastis, where the court poet is looking at the various Puranic and Itihasic traditions, the presence of memory is very important, without which it was not possible to create these lengthy genealogical lists based on Itihasa Purana and dynastic traditions. And hence, the creator of Prasasti continuously looked back to his sources to provide legitimate authority to the king, as well as create a strong social identity. Therefore, all these mechanisms of collating different sources of the past and composing a Prasasti shows that a different mode of history writing existed during the pre-modern periods, and hence we should give preeminence to this particular source. Thank you so much. So with this I end, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So thanks to all the presenters. And before we open up the thing to discussion, I was thinking that maybe we can I can show some images of the kind of sources that we have used in the book, right? So I'll just once again just share my screen briefly and tell you about the various images of some of the sources that we used in the book. So here, one of the important papers in the book, which we have not discussed in the presentations, was on what are called fragmentary inscriptions. Aruna talked about the longer donative inscriptions for the early medieval period, but in the ancient period, we had such fragmentary inscriptions. And then when you put these inscriptions into some kind of legitimate form, you find that a large number of people, from being goldsmiths to merchants to treasurers to workers to Brahmins to gardeners to ironmongers, and all kinds of people gifted to the Buddhist order. So this was an entire discussion that we had, and maybe we can further discuss this. And then this is the example of the commemorative inscription that Aruna was talking about. And these are like really lengthy, and they need expert epigraphists to read them. Another thing that was not discussed in the presentations were the question of coins. Now, coins usually we look for as for economic history, but in this case, we used the coins to look at how smaller chiefs, not the main ruling families, but smaller chiefs that coexisted prior to the major ruling families, or while coexisting alongside them, have to be recognized and have to be studied. So a detailed study of some of these coins led to the conclusion that you can understand processes of state formation in particular regions by emphasizing on these often neglected coins that people don't pay much attention to because they may not belong to major ruling families. And then, of course, there are very dramatic coinage of like the Roman coinage and all, which is well studied, but very few people recognize that these Roman coins were used as clay bullae. They were used as decoration. Indians copied these coins and wore them as like totem symbols. And there's an entire history of why the ancient Indians were fascinated with these clay bullae. I mean, coins in the with names and images of Roman emperors, but they were using it as like decorative. And these were some of the art objects that we discussed. For example, this ivory statuette, a really small ivory statuette. One was unearthed at Pompeii. I mean, after the great, volcanic eruption over there in AD 79 or so. So it was found in a merchant's house. And almost a similar one was found in India at a place called Ter. So you have a better picture of the front and the back of this ivory statues. And then we were talking about the fragmentary inscriptions. Here's an example. Of course, now this, of course, is in the sculpture gallery at the Indian Museum, Kolkata. But this particular, I mean, it seems innocuous, or it seems like also a common image that you find everywhere. But this particular one, when you go deeply into the inscription at the bottom, which you can't see very clearly, but the inscription at the bottom tells you that this was actually dedicated to the Sangha at Amravati by a person called Vidhika, who was the son of a teacher, Naga, of the Charmakara Jati. He granted this auspicious vase along with his mother, wife, brothers, son, daughters, etc., which obviously, marginalized communities in the textual traditions are never given names. They're never even discussed in terms of being able to make donations and so on, leave alone some of them becoming teachers in the Buddhist Sangha. So these are some of these very unusual kind of images that can be drawn upon depending on whichever locality you are more familiar with. And this is from Ajanta again, a merchant probably being attended to by various kinds of service people, musicians and those who provided wine and food. And finally, of course, a very unusual image which we discussed in the book was of this Chenchu Lakshmi at Ohobilam in Andhra Pradesh, where there's a major Narasimha shrine there, but the Chenchus are depicted on the walls of these temples, which of course no Agmic text or no text actually discusses these sort of images. So these are some of the images that we discussed in the book, or some of the objects that we discussed in the book. So now we can open the floor to questions and answers. And okay, so should we, Rajasmita, would you like to begin? Or
yes, ma'am. So We have 2 questions so far, and while we're going through these, I just request anyone else who has questions to put it on chat for us. The first one is from Unnati, which is addressed to Dr. Sen. Ma'am, could you please elaborate a little bit more on the difference between the concepts of reality of the past and truth of the past?
Okay. So yes, so this is a very important issue over here. See, what happens is that when you tend to give authority to a particular traditional source, then you add truth value to that source, right? So you scrutinize that source as though that source is telling you about what actually happened, right? And therefore that you're giving it a kind of a status higher than what it really deserves. Whereas when you're trying to look at reality of the past, you can have various images of that reality. That would be more realistic, right? Not to have one ideal or one truth, but to have various truths, if you can put it like this, or various ways of looking at that society. And for that reason, then you have to sort of not delegitimize that particular source, but you have to look at other minor sources that may not be so dramatic in them, having a kind of a documentary seal or a particular date, but they may be just perceptions. So if you're reading, let's say, the Charita literature, or rather than using the Charita literature to give us about, oh, this was the true reality, this was the truth of the past. No, there were several images in the way in which the reality of the past can be reflected in this kind of literature, right? So similarly, I just showed you 1 or 2 of these images. Now, these images, we can say, oh, wow, images like this were traveled to Italy in large numbers because we found this one particular image. No, that's not, so that's like appealing to giving information about something that cannot be questioned. Truth cannot be questioned, right? Whereas what one is suggesting is that there can be innumerable ways of looking at the reality, and that some of them can be questioned, some of them may have happened, but some of them may be just reflections on what a possible reality of the past. So I think that, and this is very, very true of the archaeological information that we tend to use, because archaeological information, we think, oh, well, something has been thrown up as a record, and therefore we tend to give a legitimacy to that particular object, and we disregard other minor broken pieces of objects or mutilated images. We don't pay attention to them, but they were also part of the reality, right? Just because they are not found in a refined form, that doesn't mean that we reject them. So I don't know whether I got across well enough, but others can also come in if they want to, say something more about this. And next.
Okay. So the next question is from Debojit Ghosh, which is addressed to Professor Aloka Sen. Can you provide a detailed explanation with examples regarding the difference between the reality and truth of past? So I think this is something we just covered, so I'm going to go into the next one.
Yeah, we did that.
This is from Dr. Rajnita Datta, and it's addressed to Sagnik. Even within your readings against the grain, would you not find readings of everyday life which would be in conflict with each other? A particular strand trying to hegemonize the everyday discourse is not the way you read sharpening the binaries when the picture is more complex?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Professor. Yes, I mean, it is a domain where there is always, contesting and conflicting wills. That's what I mentioned, like conflicting wills and, worldviews that will, collide in the larger, this transformative, intersubjective space. But what I'm what I tried to do in that essay also is that I tried to show that every day is a very relational, situated kind of an experience, and which is not really having any absolute essence per se. So every day does not, in that way have, for me at least, and very essential code of only being resisting to a certain kind of hegemony. We see there are kind of complexities where a chandala is basically appropriating the his own instrument of oppression, the varna dharma, to navigate a situation where he is rebuking the brahmin and the and the king and so on and so forth. So yes, I mean, these are very complex equation, and these tales had a serious ambiguities regarding what would be the standpoints, moral standpoint, and what would be. So the kind of binary that we have now of power and resistance as separate domain, I don't think in everyday resistance it is always working. So there is also compliance to a certain kind of hegemonic discourse. There is also a kind of conflict and resistance to it. There is also a kind of an avoidance of this whole discourse of what is absolutely good, what is absolutely bad, and so on and so forth. And with all these engagements, I think that is what makes this everyday experience a very complex and contradictory, I would rather say conflicting and collaborative kind of a domain as well. So it is based on the way it has been situated at a particular context, the power, and the way it has been approached by, let's say, common people, and how it has been negotiated in the end. Only there we can find this kind of everydayness or the ordinary ethics, and not really having any substantial essence of this is what I call ordinary, or this is what I call dominant, or so on and so forth. I don't know whether I have been able to given you the answer, but I hope.
Yeah. What I think is that one of the things that is brought out in each of the presentations is to problematize the nature of the source. Because so far one has been looking at history to draw upon these sources and use them, as though they are sacrosanct and that they cannot be questioned. The source cannot be questioned, right? And so therefore, when you put the source as like a truly objective goal, that they're giving you a truly objective goal, that becomes problematic. So whereas the reality may be very different from what is represented in that singular source, right? So that is why if you question the nature of the source and then talk about various sources, drawing upon various sources, then you will get a better picture of, let's say, because the source is always emanating from the dominant. But when you look at a fragmentary inscription, or you look at this fragment here and there, we don't know. Definitely they come from the nature of the source. They come from a different set of people. They don't necessarily emanate from a political authority or a religious authority, and so on and so forth. So how do you identify the source which does not necessarily emanate from a source of authority, and then problematize it? That, I think, gives a better picture of the reality of the past, rather than getting a singular image and sort of raising a source onto a pedestal so that it is giving you the truth of the past, right? So that's, I think, it's the whole discourse about what is history, the nature of history as a discipline, no? Yeah, please unmute yourself if you want to counter what we have said.
So thank you so much. Since there are no questions in chat for now, could I put one question to you all from my end? So, yes. Which is that, Professor Sen, you were talking about the relation between history and the fictional while not mixing the two. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, this is something that's like really, really important, but also important to me on a like at the stage that I am in doing my study of periodical histories, women's periodical histories in modern India. So I always find it like tricky terrain with periodical, especially because it's between, like, so much of it is non-fiction, but there are also a lot of fictional accounts that this medium offers. So when this medium kind of falls very squarely in this in-between space, how does one specifically navigate this relation between the historical and the fictional?
So you are dealing with which period? The periodical?
So I'm looking at, my study starts around 1857 and will end at 1947.
Okay, so Rajesh, do you want to take that, because he looks at that period more closely, and then I will come in after he responds, right?
Yes.
Because he is more familiar with that period.
Yeah, I think what I will try to do is I'll try to relate with the earlier discussion on the reality and the truth that you are talking about. I think from my own essay, I'll give an example. The story of the rediscovery of Tamil classics is largely recounted from the perspective of the autobiography of one of the chief editors of classics, whose life, in fact, the autobiography recounts his experiences at the dominant Shaivite monastery in Tamil Nadu. So the point is, to what extent does it reflect the reality? In fact, a very category that is employed by historians to to explain this transformation of an ancient literature in the modern period, that is the rediscovery. The very idea of rediscovery stems from a limited perspective. In other words, it stems from the self-perception of the editor of the classics. But autobiography can also be read differently. There are also portions in the autobiography where Swaminathan Iyer talks about his travels to those regions where he encounters poets and scholars who are not always affiliated with the monasteries, and encounter manuscript cultures. The way palm leaf manuscripts were maintained by these poets and scholars. And one of the questions I pose is, what is the literary culture of these unknown poets and scholars who are not, always dominant figures, and we don't find them represented in the, in histories of reproduction of classics. They were the ones who maintained manuscripts and transmitted them. So it is necessary to study the everyday literary practices of these poets outside the orbit of the dominant monasteries. Also, there are also other interesting set of sources that can be examined. While no doubt this autobiography is a useful memoir to recount the histories of transmission and reproduction of classics. We also have the early colonial archives. Some of the surveyors have collected catalogs of books from Jain monasteries and also from the other centers. So nobody has looked into the potentiality of these catalogs. What kind of books were there? What kind of documents where palm leaf manuscripts were read and transmitted, and so on. Perhaps looking into these alternative set of sources will allow us to recount the histories of transmission and reproduction in interesting ways than looking at solely from a singular source like the autobiography, that also located largely in the dominant Shaivite context.
Yeah. So that brings us to focus on what you're looking at, that is periodicals. And immediately, Rajasmita, what occurs to me is that when Sagnik was talking about the fact that sort of a kind of a collective memories embedded in textual traditions that we give a lot of authority to. For the very ancient past, we are ignoring that those were also just simply various versions of what they thought should be retained. Now, in your case, they are written, right? They are written material, and obviously, even in the 19th century, when you're looking at popular periodicals, I mean, there's a lot of imagination that goes into the making of stories or making of life histories, and so on and so forth. So what are we suggesting? What we are suggesting is that what Hayden White actually had suggested is that, you see, the fictional is not untouchable, right? The fictional is part of the construction of what is historical. Okay, and that's precisely the point. Even let's say when Sagnik is talking about the Jatakas, which were like really rejected, lock, stock and barrel, or alternatively, they were used to, give a singular truth about this exactly happened. Peasants actually rebelled against kings, right? That kind of a history. The point is that these Jatakas are then transmitted into historical objects of study in art, right? So it's a historical, it becomes a historical source. But then when it is transmitted into this art object, then there are certain limitations of the artists. What is he or she, well, not she, but what is he depicting of that Jataka? Is it the wild of the Jataka story, or is it the sanitized urban space of the Jataka story? What is being transmitted? So I would say that if you're looking at, the type, I don't know what the type of journals that you're looking at, but I think that any popular reconstruction of the past must have the fictional, because without the fictional, then you are looking at a very sterile picture. I mean, I don't think it is possible to create a sterile picture of the past reality, right? So far, unfortunately, especially in the early half of the 20th century, when you're trying to differentiate different types of sources as this is more authentic and this is less authentic, the more authentic then is giving you a singular image purporting to be the reality or the truth of the past. Actually, realities are complex. I mean, look at our own lives, the kind of realities that we are living in the midst of, right? So I think that it's a very difficult thing to do, because we are working within the strictures of what history has been told to us. I would rather think that a marriage between remembered histories and the histories that we try to construct from formal sources should be done. There should be a combination of both these collective historical memories and if they are found in a particular source, I think we have to sort of maybe give them more importance than we usually do, not deny the fictional. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful.
Good. I hope all the best for your.
Thank you. Okay, there is another question that's come up. This is from B. Lakshmi Gayatri. It doesn't say who this is addressed to, but y'all can take it up as y'all wish. With the never-ending archaeological discoveries, how can we rewrite and reinterpret our history, and to what extent can we do so?
Yeah, precise. Well, anybody can take it, but what I would suggest is that that's exactly it. There is no such thing as a solid given historical which has to be canonized and all. History is constantly a dialogue of the past with the present. And so if there are more discoveries, in fact, what I am arguing is that it's not only the new never-ending archaeological discoveries, it's the already discovered, which is discarded in bags of pottery and bags of, unopened boxes of archaeological discoveries, which can tell you a totally different story about the history of the subcontinent, right, in different localities of the country. So I think that one has to be open to new. I mean, there's no such thing as a solidified notion of history that cannot change, right? There's no such. That is why memory is a process. Whereas history has this big anxiety of constantly sifting out and putting in, organizing and all. They imagine that the organization will be for eternity. But that organization is not for eternity, because constantly, as you yourself are saying, they go on, what do you call it? It goes on increasing. So we have to reinterpret. I would just put it down like that. We have to reinterpret. We have not, by the way, in this book, we have not used absolutely new archaeological material. Much of this material is available to us. The coins were available to us. Thousands and thousands of these minor coins found in archaeological excavations were available, but they were rejected because they did not belong to a major ruling family of the region. Right? They belong to local key chiefs and local. So instead of writing a political history of the local chiefs, we thought that they can give us a good idea about the process of the making of the state in the early Deccan of this region. So I think there are innovative ways of using existing archaeological material, but also maybe we have to be open to reconsidering our interpretations. So there's another question for...
Yes, so this is from Deeptarko to Dr. Pariti. Since you spoke about prashastis, how should a researcher use them to reconstruct questions of power, legitimacy, and social origins of certain rulers and dynasties? And he requests if you could please elaborate with a small example, maybe.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yes, it's quite an interesting question. Let me take the example of Chalukyas, which I have already done a research on. So here we have the prashastis in which genealogical information is very important, because the genealogies, where we have the mythical genealogies and historical genealogies, these two genealogies are very important, because the mythical genealogies, they talk about the family's origins. Though some of these, and what is very interesting is we don't find, particularly for the Chalukyas, they don't really refer to which family they belong to, but interestingly, they borrow certain, the mythical aspects, like referring to their Gotra and these things from the Kadambas. Kadambas who ruled, who were the predecessors who ruled before the Chalukyas. So, for example, Hariti Putranam, and that they belong to Manavya Gotra. These are Manavya Gotra, and these are the things that they try to adopt from the predecessors. And these mythical genealogies are really useful for us to understand the social origins of that particular dynasty. And though people, historians have discarded this, but they tell us that take us to atemporal times, and these genealogies, this Gotra and these affiliations, even till today we use while showing our own affiliation to a particular sage or a rishi and all. And similarly, historical genealogies are very significant, because they help us, because here the rulers, they're trying to link up, or trying to give a genealogy of their ancestors. Okay, 3 generations or 4 generations, and sometimes even when we take the example of Eastern Chalukyas, the Sataluri inscription of Gunaga Vijayaditya gives about 20 generations, and then it follows the later rulers also gives about 30. In some inscriptions of later Chalukyan families, we have 30 generations of rulers. Why are they doing all this? Because the lengthier the genealogies, historical genealogies, their power and their legitimacy to that power would be more stronger, and they have to differentiate with the local people who are all local rulers and all. So in order to enhance their social identity and all, these type of genealogies are very, very important, and hence there was this attempt to reconstruct this genealogical information, and they were constantly trying to take down, or record the names, and also take only those type of rulers who have achieved, who have contributed to the family, and the rulers who were, or the family members who did not really, contribute to the family, or who were betrayers and all, their names were forgotten. So in this process of selection of the family histories also, there's a conscious attempt to select only certain names. So as Romala Thapa says, there is a tendency of telescoping the information in these historical genealogies. And why they are doing? Because they are looking at only certain aspects which would give them legitimacy to their power at that particular period of time. So I think I've answered the question.
And there's also one point we can add, that many local ruling families, Chalukyas included, they have sort of unknown origins. So this question of trying to draw upon a pan-Indian, sort of imagery or the gotras of a particular kind is to seek legitimacy for that. So, I mean, the Chalukyas came from some pastoral Chalukya group of people who were like unknown in the middle of the Deccan, sort of dry, semi-arid zones of the Deccan. So to create, and soon, of course, through military might become powerful, and then to gain legitimacy, then they have to draw upon. So what Aruna has been suggesting is that why the mythical is important is because that gives legitimacy to distance themselves away from their original origins, right? And then they reconstruct a notion of their past. I mean, their social identity, of course, but also their way of looking at history, because they are not rejecting the mythical, or they are not rejecting the semi-historical. So they are also drawing upon the memory of the mythical to gain legitimacy in their contemporary, right? So this sort of umbilical cord, you see, what is happening is that we have been rejecting the mythical and the semi-historical for reasons that they are absolutely fictional nonsense, this, that, and the other. But the use of that mythical and semi-historical to give regional identity. What have the Chalukyas to do with Yudhishthira and Bhima and so on and so forth? Nothing. And the Gotras also, I mean, many of these Gotras, they are not local Gotras, right? They draw upon Gotras which are like almost pan-Indian, right?
Exactly.
I don't know. Does that
Yes.
answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So we don't have any more questions, I think. Anybody wants to say anything? Would you like to say anything, any of you?
It's a very interesting one. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, and Megha and Rajosmita, and thank you so much for giving this opportunity to us and to address this various importance of these various sources. And
thank you for making the time to do this. It's really been, every time I sit through sessions like this, I keep wondering, why did I not take up history?
But all of you are literature people, right?
Rajasmita is a very, very, very history person.
Acha, she's very history. I have the impression there are a lot of literature people around.
Yeah, Ranika is the literature person and I'm the art person. So we make a fairly good team like this.
So we are trying to suggest that we have to move away from documentary, hardcore, historical thing to more literature, to more art, and to more painting, and so on and so forth.
Yes,
right?
We are with you on that.
Yeah.
Totally.
These are right. Okay. Somebody is asking, can she be unmuted, Ranjita?
Yeah, you can do it yourself. I have kind of opened it up to unmuting.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, okay, now I have to make myself visible. Just a moment. Anyway, thank you so much for this This has been a very exciting book. I also want to add a bit to it, is that recently there have been some works, though I have not seen them in print, about historians talking about their own experience with the archives. The experiential, because we generally as researchers and historians tend to hide ourselves from the sources that we are examining. So I think in that sense, this book, the collection of essays, particularly your introduction, ma'am, makes a lot of, it sort of gives a lot of incentive to, come up with future, works where we should actually examine our own experiences with the sources that we handle and the kind of history that we decide to then interpret from those sources. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks a lot, Ranjita. The thing is that there is a maybe we should have a face-to-face thing where we can actually sort of place much of the material that has been corrected. And the question is of reading, how do you read these sources? One is, how do you bring them into the focus, which are not being used so far but are available? The other is how to read them. And then the tendency has been that we read them in a particular way to give a certain interpretation of history. We are giving more importance to the narrative of history rather than to the source. What we are saying is that the source itself is located in a worldview. That worldview of the source has to be locally generated, right? It cannot be, now the Chalukyan inscriptions are locally located. Now, how they frame, how the record keepers, how they use material that is given to them, what they draw upon, why they draw upon something, and not. Rajesh also pointed out, right? I mean, there are all these sort of Shaivite monastic people outside of the monastery, right? And they're just existing, and they're kind of very valuable in the way the way we read the Sangam literature, or the way we understand its collection also, right? So I think we need to, sort of get hold of that.
Also, just the last thing, there are so many works on historical methods outside India. We rarely get to, have something like this in our own South Asian context. So that way, this book is really helpful. It sort of, at least for me, it sort of makes me look at, how the methods of history should be, and how they have been practiced, within the subcontinent. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Right. So Aruna, you got your, he says, thank you for the insightful reading of the inscription. He's reading Gurjara Pratiharas. That would be similar. That would be similar. Yes. And that if you look at the Prashastis rather than only the grant portion of the inscription, that would tell you much more about who just like the Chalukes, just like the pastoral nomads of the Deccan, the Gurjara Pratiharas are also Gujars, right? And doorkeepers, right? Their yes. Pratiharas are the doorkeepers, right? They also seek a legitimacy for themselves.
And moreover, all these dynasties are contemporary. So this type of trend, what we see in Chalukyas, in Chalukyan inscriptions, we also see in the Pallava inscriptions, Chola inscriptions, Pala, Senas, and even the Rajput inscriptions. That's what even B.D. Chattopadhyaya had looked at inscriptions of Gurjara Pratiharas and others. And he also looked, tried to understand the Prasastis in a similar way. So,
okay. Absolutely. Okay, so Megha, over to you. We have been on time.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Rajasmita, do you want to add anything before we close this session?
No. Just that, as always, it's been so good to listen to this.
So you let us know whether there were any YouTube listeners and questions on YouTube. Ranita, were there any YouTube listeners?
A very small number. There were 5 or 6 at the highest, and no questions when I last checked, but I will check again right now.
No problem. No, I just wanted to know that was at the last minute we decided. Anyway, the mystery of why so many people registered and not joined will remain.
So
A
people
mystery.
also watch at their own leisure.
Yeah,
You know,
I think so.
Oh,
Yeah.
so
okay.
that also
And
happens. Yeah.
I'm happy that my students have joined, ma'am. 2 of my research scholars and 3 of my students have joined.
Acha, you're happy.
So, and one of my student, Lakshmi Gayatri, also asked you a question. So
Okay,
I'm happy
okay.
that they're
So
interested
you're
in
happy,
this.
yes. That's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No
Okay.
questions, 5 likes.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks,
Thank
Manu.
you, ma'am. Thank you.
So this will be on your YouTube channel for some time?
It will be, yes, it will be there for ever.
For the rest of the
Yeah.
time.
Okay. All right. So we can pass on the info to others, right?
Yes, and also we will also put a link on the History for Peace website.
Okay.
So it will be there on our
Okay.
website also. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye
you.
then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Everybody. Yeah.
Thank you,
It
ma'am.
was
Thank
nice.
you.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you so much. Bye. So we'll say goodbye and we'll see each other maybe next time.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Bye.
Sometime soon.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bye.
Okay, bye.